I never thought old age would arrive quietly. No warning. No sound. Just one morning when I realized people had started talking about me instead of to me. I still walked the same floors, touched the same walls, brewed the same tea in the same chipped cup. Yet somehow, in their eyes, I had already become someone who was in the way. This house was built by my hands and my husband's patience. Every brick carries a memory. The nights we stayed awake counting money. The winters when we wrapped blankets around unfinished walls. The summers when our son ran barefoot through rooms that had no doors yet. I didn't inherit this place. I earned it with my life. After my husband died, silence settled here like dust. My son said I shouldn't live alone. He said family stays together. His wife agreed, smiling gently, telling me how lucky I was. First, I believed her. I wanted to believe her. Loneliness makes you grateful for even borrowed kindness. But kindness changes when it gets tired. Her sighs grew louder. Her patience thinner. She started rearranging rooms without asking, measuring walls with her eyes, talking about space and future plans. I told myself it meant nothing. Old women survive by ignoring what hurts. Still, at night I lay awake listening. Not to the house, but to the way my name was spoken behind closed doors, as if it already belonged to the past. It started with small things, the kind you almost feel ashamed to notice. My chair at the table was moved closer to the wall. My cup was replaced with another lighter one. So it's easier for you. Conversations stopped when I entered the room, then restarted with forced smiles and softer voices. I became fragile in their minds long before I felt fragile in my body. One afternoon I heard her on the phone. She didn't know I was in the hallway. She spoke calmly, efficiently, the way people do when they talk about objects, not lives. She said the word facility. She said professionals. She said it's safer this way. I stood there holding a basket of laundry, frozen, listening to my life being reorganized by someone who had never washed these sheets before. When I asked my son later what she meant, he didn't answer right away. He looked at the floor, at his hands, anywhere but at me. That silence told me more than any cruel sentence could have. He said they were just discussing options. He said I was getting older. He said they worried. He never said he wanted me to stay. That night I walked through the house slowly. I touched the door frames we once marked with our son's height. I sat on the bed where my husband took his last breath and promised me I would never be alone. I wondered when promises expire, and who decides that an old woman's place can be traded for convenience. In the mirror I searched my face for weakness. What I saw instead was someone who had survived worse than whispers. A few days later she finally said it out loud. Not in anger. Not even unkindly. She chose a quiet afternoon when the house was calm, when my son was at work, when it would be just the two of us and no witnesses. She sat across from me, folded her hands and spoke slowly, as if explaining something to a child. She said places existed where people like me were taken care of, where meals were prepared, doctors were nearby, and no one had to worry. She said I deserved rest. She said I had done enough. Every sentence sounded reasonable, almost generous. That was the cruelest part. She never asked what I wanted. She spoke as if the decision had already settled into the walls. When I asked where this idea came from, she hesitated for half a second too long. Then she mentioned money, repairs, the market, how large houses were a burden. She said it would be easier for everyone if things were simpler, smaller, lighter. I understood then that I was the heaviest thing left in this house. That evening my son repeated her words, but softer, like he hoped they would hurt less if spoken gently. He said it was temporary. He said we could visit. He said the house could finally be sold and they could start fresh. Start fresh. As if my life was clutter that needed clearing away. I nodded. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I learned long ago that when people expect weakness, silence scares them more. Inside something hardened. Not bitterness. Clarity. I realized they were not waiting for my agreement. They were waiting for my disappearance. And for the first time I began to think not about where I might go, but about what they believed they already owned. That night I couldn't sleep. The house sounded different once you know people are planning to empty it. Every creak felt like a goodbye. I walked from room to room, not with nostalgia but with attention. I opened drawers I hadn't touched in years. I looked behind shelves, under stairs, inside old boxes labeled with fading ink. Not because I was looking for memories, but because I suddenly understood how easily a life can be erased when others decide it no longer fits. In the back bedroom, the one they had already started calling the spare, I found a small metal box. It was heavy, colder than I expected. Inside were papers my husband and I had signed decades ago. Back when we trusted that blood would always mean protection. We never imagined a day when our own child would be silent while someone measured the price of our walls. The documents were old but clear. The house was still mine. Entirely mine. I sat on the floor holding those papers, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Ground beneath my feet. Not anger. Not revenge. Control. All this time they spoke as if my future had already been arranged, neatly packaged and moved elsewhere. They spoke as if the house had already changed hands. They never once checked. They never thought I might still be standing. The next morning, she talked about packing schedules and visiting hours. She spoke confidently, already imagining empty rooms and fresh listings. I listened quietly, stirring my tea, letting her words float past me like smoke. There is a strange power in being underestimated. When people think you are weak, they forget to hide their intentions. I looked around the kitchen at the table where my son learned to eat, where he learned to lie without speaking. I realized then, this wasn't just about a house. It was about whether I would leave quietly, or remind them that I had never truly left at all. I decided not to tell anyone what I had found. Not yet. Truth is most powerful when it arrives unexpectedly. I folded the papers carefully and returned them to the box, then placed it back where time had hidden it for me. That day, I moved slowly, deliberately, playing the role they had already written for me. I asked questions about the place she had chosen, about the room, about the window. She seemed relieved. Agreement, even false, makes people careless. She started talking freely after that. About how the house would sell quickly. About how much space they would finally have. About turning memories into renovations. She spoke as if I were already gone, as if my presence had become theoretical. My son listened beside her, nodding, trapped between comfort and shame. He never looked at me when she spoke about signing papers. In the afternoon, I walked into the garden. I pressed my hands into the soil my husband once turned with pride. I remembered every sacrifice that built this place, every meal skipped, every promise made. They thought age had softened me. They forgot that endurance is a kind of strength. That evening, I wrote nothing. I packed nothing. Instead, I waited. Because when people rush to erase you, they never notice when you begin to prepare. And I was no longer preparing to leave. I was preparing to stay on my terms. For the first time since my husband died, I felt something steady inside me. Not fear. Not sorrow. Resolve. The next few days passed as if we were all acting in the same play, pretending not to know the ending. She began bringing pamphlets home, leaving them casually on the table where I could see them. Bright rooms. Smiling strangers. Words like care and community printed in soft colors. I picked them up, turned the pages slowly, and placed them back exactly where she wanted. Silence can be cooperation, if that's how others choose to read it. My son started spending less time at home. When he was there, he kept himself busy, fixing things that were not broken, scrolling through his phone, avoiding rooms where I sat. I watched him carefully. I raised him to be kind, not brave. Now I saw the cost of that difference. He wasn't cruel. He was simply easier to convince than to confront. One morning she mentioned a date. Not a question. A statement. She said they would come see me the following week, just to talk. I smiled and thanked her. Inside I counted the days. I thought about timing. About how truth, like medicine, works best when taken at the right moment. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after the lights were turned off upstairs. I laid the documents out in front of me again, smoothing the creases with my hands. I read every line slowly, carefully, as if reading my own name back into existence. Outside, the house stood quiet and patient. It had waited decades, could wait a little longer. They believed I was running out of time. What they didn't understand was that I had already stopped giving it away. The day before their visit, she cleaned the house with unusual energy. Windows were opened, shelves cleared. Personal things quietly shifted aside. It felt less like preparing for guests and more like rehearsing an absence. My belongings became smaller, fewer. as if she were already imagining how easily my life could fit into one room somewhere else. She handed me a list that afternoon. Clothes to pack, medications, personal items. She suggested I choose only what mattered most. I looked at the paper for a long moment, then folded it and placed it in my pocket. How does one reduce a lifetime into bullet points? How do you decide which memories deserve to survive? My son tried to speak to me that evening. His voice shook. He said he hoped I understood they were doing this out of love. I listened without interrupting. Love, I had learned, is often the word people use when they don't want to say convenience. I asked him one question, just one. I asked if he would still be able to sell the house if I refused to go. He didn't answer. That was answer enough. Later, alone in my room, I packed nothing. Instead, I placed the documents into a clean envelope and set it on the table by my bed. I slept deeply that night, not because I felt safe, but because I felt ready. In the morning, the house felt tense, like it was holding its breath. They believed today would decide my future. They were right, but not in the way they expected. Some moments don't announce themselves as turning points. They arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary days, waiting for someone to stand their ground. They arrived just after noon. Two people with polite smiles and practiced voices, carrying folders and calm assurances. They spoke slowly, clearly, as if volume and simplicity could soften what they were there to take. They asked me how I felt, if I slept well, if I understood why they had come. I answered politely. I had spent a lifetime being polite when it was expected. She sat beside my son, confident, already leaning forward as if guiding the conversation. She explained how the move would work, how quickly it could be arranged, how relieved everyone would be once things were settled. The word settled was repeated often. It sounded final, convenient, clean. When they asked if I had any questions, I said yes. I asked who had given permission to make these arrangements. The room shifted. My son cleared his throat. She smiled tightly and said families make decisions together. I nodded and reached for the envelope I had placed on the table. I slid it across the surface slowly. I told them to read before speaking further. The sound of paper opening was louder than any argument. I watched their expressions change, not dramatically but enough. Confusion first, then hesitation. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply stated facts. The house was mine. Legally. Fully. It had never been transferred. Any plans made without my consent were meaningless. Silence followed. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Honest. For the first time since this began, I wasn't being discussed. I was being listened to. She was the first to speak again, but her confidence had thinned. She said there must be some mistake, that surely papers had been signed years ago, that this was just a misunderstanding. Her voice stayed calm, but her hands betrayed her, gripping the edge of the chair too tightly. I watched her carefully. When people lose control, they reach for denial before truth. My son finally looked at me then. Really looked. Not as a responsibility, not as an obstacle, but as someone who had been silent for too long. He asked why I had never said anything. I told him the truth, that I was never asked, that I assumed trust meant safety, that I believed family would protect what it didn't yet understand. He lowered his head. Some realizations arrived too late to be gentle. The visitors exchanged glances and closed their folders. They said politely that without my consent there was nothing more to discuss. They stood, thanked me for my time, and left the house as quietly as they had entered. The door closed behind them with a sound that felt permanent. She turned to me then, her face no longer careful. She said I was being selfish. She said I was holding everyone back. She said I was thinking only of myself. I listened, calm, steady. When she finished, I said something she did not expect. I said this house was never meant to be payment for my silence. I said growing old did not mean surrendering my place in the world. My son said nothing. But in his quiet I saw something shift. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But awareness, the beginning of something that could no longer be undone. That evening the house felt unfamiliar again. Not empty but exposed. The truth had been spoken aloud, and nothing settles easily after that. She avoided me, moving through rooms quickly, as if the walls themselves had betrayed her. My son sat in the living room long after dinner, staring at nothing, weighed down by a silence he had helped create. Later he came to my door. He didn't knock at first. He stood there uncertain like the boy he once was when he knew he had done something wrong, but didn't yet know how to say it. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. He asked if I had planned this, if I had waited deliberately. I told him I had waited because I was given no choice. He said they were struggling. That money was tight. That selling the house had seemed like the only way forward. I listened, but I did not bend. Struggle does not give permission. Need does not erase dignity. I reminded him that I had never asked for payment for raising him. I only asked not to be discarded when I became inconvenient. That night I locked my door for the first time in years. Not out of fear, but as a boundary. I lay awake listening to the house breathe around me, feeling both heavier and lighter at once. There is a cost to standing your ground, but there is a greater cost to losing it quietly. They thought the conversation was over. They were wrong. Because when people realize they cannot take something from you, they often try a different approach, one that hides behind guilt, patience, and time. And I was learning finally to recognize that too. The days that followed were slower, heavier, as if the house itself was adjusting to the truth. She became polite again, almost overly so. She brought me tea without being asked if I needed anything, spoke in careful tones. It wasn't kindness returning, it was strategy. I had seen this before in life. When force fails, people try patience. My son suggested compromises. Small ones, he said. Maybe I could stay for now. Maybe later we would revisit the conversation. He spoke as if time itself would persuade me to disappear. I told him calmly that my decision was not temporary. I wasn't postponing my life. I was continuing it. She began mentioning my age again. My memory. My health. Each concern was wrapped in worry, but sharpened by implication. I answered her with facts. I managed my days. I paid my bills. I knew exactly where I stood. Watching her realize this was quietly satisfying. One afternoon I found my old photo albums moved from the shelf. She said she was organizing. I placed them back myself slowly, deliberately, one by one. Possession is not always about ownership. Sometimes it's about presence. That night my son asked me what I planned to do. I told him the truth. I planned to stay. To live. To remain visible. He sighed, tired. I understood his exhaustion. But exhaustion does not excuse erasure. I had survived grief, poverty, and loneliness. I would not be undone by convenience disguised as concern. And deep inside I sensed it. This was no longer just my fight. It was a lesson they could not avoid learning. Tension has a way of seeping into everything. Meals became quiet, measured. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Doors closed more carefully than before. We were all aware now that something fragile had cracked, and no one knew how to repair it without admitting fault. She avoided direct arguments, choosing instead to let discomfort speak for her. I noticed changes in how she spoke to others about me. On the phone, she lowered her voice, saying I was confused or emotional. Not openly, not cruelly, just enough to plant doubt. I heard my own life being rewritten in fragments. That hurt more than any confrontation. When people question your clarity, they slowly take your authority. My son listened to her, even when he said nothing. Silence, I learned, is often agreement wearing a softer face. I didn't confront them. I didn't need to. Truth does not require constant defense once it has been stated clearly. One morning I went to the bank alone. I reviewed my accounts, my documents, my options. I made sure no one could speak for me without permission. It felt strange, reclaiming responsibilities I had trusted others to handle. But it also felt right. Independence, I realized, doesn't disappear with age. It is simply taken when you stop guarding it. When I returned home, she watched me carefully, as if sensing a shift. She asked where I had been. I told her I was taking care of my affairs. The word "my" landed heavily between us. That evening, as I sat by the window, I understood something important. They had underestimated me once. They would not be given the chance to do it again. A week later, I overheard a conversation that confirmed what I already knew. She was speaking to a real estate agent. She didn't say my name, but she didn't need to. She talked about timing, about preparing the property, about eventual availability. She was planning ahead, counting on weariness to do what permission could not. I didn't interrupt. I waited until the call ended. Then I walked into the room and asked calmly who she was speaking with. She froze for just a moment, then recovered, saying she was only gathering information. I told her information without consent is still intention. She said nothing. That night, my son asked why I couldn't just let things be easier. He said he felt trapped between loyalty and reality. I told him reality is not something you choose when it's comfortable. It is something you face when it's difficult. He looked away, and I knew he understood more than he wanted to admit. I began making small changes after that. I took back rooms that had slowly been claimed. I brought my things out of storage. I filled shelves with photographs and books again. Presence is powerful. It reminds people that you are not waiting to vanish. She grew impatient. Her smiles tightened. Her kindness expired quickly when it no longer produced results. I watched her carefully, not with fear but with clarity. People reveal themselves when they realize you will not move aside. I was no longer reacting. I was deciding. And in that shift from endurance to intention, I felt something settle inside me. This house wasn't just my past. It was my proof that I still belonged to myself. The pressure didn't stop. It simply changed shape. She began speaking about my future as if it were already shrinking. Asking whether I would still be able to manage stairs next year, whether winter might be too hard for me, whether I had thought about what comes next. Each question was wrapped in concern but carried the same message. You won't last here. I answered her calmly every time. I told her I had thought about the future more than she realized. I had lived long enough to know that fear is often sold as care. My son listened, torn, shifting his weight from one side to the other like a man standing on a fault line. One evening he asked me what I would do if something happened to me. I asked him what he planned to do while I was still here. The difference mattered. He had been preparing for my absence instead of respecting my presence. He said nothing after that. I started spending more time outside the house. I visited neighbors, old friends, people who remembered me before I was labeled fragile. I told my story quietly, not to seek sympathy, but to be seen. Visibility is a kind of protection. When I returned home, she seemed unsettled by how full my days had become. Dependence had been part of her plan. Independence disrupted it. That night, as I locked my door again, I understood something clearly. They had expected time to weaken me. Instead, time had sharpened my resolve. And whatever came next, I would meet it standing. Not as a burden, but as the woman who built the life they were trying to take from her. The breaking point came quietly, the way most truths do. One morning I found a folder on the kitchen counter. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't even closed properly. Inside were listings, estimates, notes written in her handwriting. Words like quick sale and as is circled confidently. My name appeared only once in small letters, followed by a question mark. I didn't confront her right away. I made tea. I sat down. I let the weight of that folder settle inside me. Plans had continued, despite everything I had said. Consent had never truly mattered to her. She was simply waiting for me to grow tired of resisting. When my son came home, I placed the folder in front of him. I asked him to explain it. He read through the pages slowly, his face tightening with every line. He looked at her. She said nothing at first. Then she said she was only being practical, that they needed security, that I was standing in the way of their future. I told them something I had not said before. I told them that if they continued making plans without my permission, I would take steps they wouldn't like. Legal ones. Final ones. The room went still. Threats are not always loud. Sometimes they are simply statements of fact. That night, my son sat alone for a long time. I could hear the house holding its breath again. I wondered which mattered more to him now, peace or conscience. I went to bed knowing one thing for certain. They could no longer pretend this was about my care. It was about control. After that day, something finally cracked between us. Not loudly, not violently, but enough that pretending became impossible. She stopped trying to charm me. I stopped pretending not to notice. The house settled into an honest tension. Uncomfortable but real. My son avoided choosing sides, but choices are made even in avoidance. I could see it wearing on him, the weight of two futures pulling in opposite directions. One built on convenience, the other on responsibility. I did not envy him, but I no longer protected him from that weight either. I contacted a lawyer quietly, not to threaten but to protect myself. I wanted clarity, boundaries written in ink, not hope. When I returned home with documents in my bag, I didn't announce it. I didn't need to. Security does not require explanation. She sensed the shift immediately. She asked if I was planning something. I told her I was securing what was already mine. She accused me of mistrust. I reminded her that trust is preserved by honesty, not demanded in its absence. That evening, my son asked if I would ever forgive them. I told him forgiveness was not a transaction. It did not arrive on command. It arrived after accountability. He nodded slowly, absorbing a lesson he should have learned long ago. As I sat alone later, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't fighting to keep the house anymore. I was fighting to be seen as a person whose life still had value. Not an obstacle to be managed, but a voice that mattered. The lawyer confirmed what I already knew, but hearing it aloud steadied me. The house was protected. My rights were clear. No one could move me, sell anything, or decide my future without my written consent. Power doesn't always feel like strength. Sometimes it feels like relief, the kind that lets you breathe fully again. When I came home, she was waiting in the kitchen. She asked where I had been. I told her the truth. Her face tightened, and for the first time she dropped the careful tone. She said I was tearing the family apart, that I was choosing bricks over people. I listened without interrupting, then told her quietly that people do not disappear when they become inconvenient. Families fall apart when they pretend that is acceptable. My son stood between us, silent. I asked him one question, whether he wanted me gone, or whether he had simply allowed someone else to want it loudly enough for both of them. He didn't answer. But his eyes filled, and in that moment, I saw regret arrive too late to be gentle. That night, I slept with the documents beside my bed. Not out of fear, but as a reminder of who I was before they tried to reduce me. Of the woman who survived loss and still stood. In the morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I told them I would not leave, but I would also no longer live under quiet hostility. Things would change, either with honesty or with distance. Because dignity is not something you negotiate away. It is something you defend, even when the people across from you share your blood. Change did not come immediately. It never does. Instead, there was a strange pause, like the moment after a storm when everything looks the same, but nothing is. She became distant, cold in a way that was no longer hidden behind smiles. My son tried to restore normalcy, cooking dinners, fixing small things around the house, as if routine could glue us back together. I watched them both carefully, not with suspicion but with honesty. I had stopped hoping they would suddenly become different people. Hope, I realized, can be another way of surrendering control. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was observing. One evening, she told my son they needed space. Not from me, she said, but from the situation. From tension. From stress. I knew what she meant. Space had always been her solution. Remove the problem. Clear the room. Start fresh. My son listened, exhausted, nodding slowly, as if rest mattered more than resolution. A few days later, I heard them arguing behind closed doors. Not whispers this time. Real voices. Real frustration. My name was spoken plainly, without softness. I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. The truth had finally forced its way into the open. That night, my son came to me and said they were thinking of moving out. Temporarily, he said. Until things settled. I looked at him and asked who he thought things would settle for. He didn't answer. But he didn't look relieved either. After he left the room, I sat alone and felt something unexpected. Peace. Because for the first time, the house was no longer shrinking around me. It was expanding, making space not for absence, but for truth. They moved quietly. No announcement. No confrontation. Boxes appeared in the hallway, then disappeared. Rooms emptied without ceremony. She avoided me entirely. My son spoke little, his voice careful, weighed down by choices he could no longer pretend were temporary. I did not help them pack. I did not watch. Some separations need witnesses. Others need dignity. On the last morning, my son stood in the doorway with his jacket in his hands. He asked if this was really how it had to be. I told him it was the way they had chosen. Silence had led us here, not anger. He nodded, accepting something he had delayed too long. When the door closed behind them, the house felt different. Not lonely but honest. The air moved freely again. I walked through each room slowly, not to grieve but to reclaim. I opened windows. I rearranged chairs. I brought my photographs back into the light. Later that day, a neighbor stopped by. She had heard rumors. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to. My life no longer required explanation. Stability does not come from approval. It comes from alignment. That evening, I sat on the front steps as the sun went down. I thought about everything I had been prepared to lose, and everything I had refused to surrender. Love does not demand erasure. Family does not require obedience at the cost of self. I did not know what the future held, but I knew one thing clearly. I had not been saved by luck or law. I had saved myself by refusing to disappear quietly. In the weeks that followed, I learned how loud peace can be. Without their footsteps, the house no longer flinched. I woke when I wanted, cooked what I liked. I left lights on without apology. Independence, I discovered, is not dramatic, it is steady. It settles into you like warmth. My son called once. His voice was careful, measured, as if he were afraid of saying the wrong thing and losing what little connection remained. He asked if I was managing. I told him I was more than managing. I was living. He paused, then said he was glad. I believed he meant it, even if understanding lagged behind intention. She did not call. That absence spoke clearly. Some people only value you when you serve a purpose. When you stop being useful, they stop pretending. I accepted that without bitterness. Acceptance is not forgiveness. It is clarity without illusions. I began repairing small things around the house. Loose hinges, chipped paint, a stubborn window that hadn't opened in years. Each fix felt symbolic, like stitching myself back into the place I belonged. I invited neighbors for tea. Laughter returned, hesitant at first, then real. One afternoon, I found an old note my husband had left in a drawer. It said, "Stand where you are planted." I held it for a long time, feeling how true it still was. This house had tried to be taken from me. So had my voice. Both were still here. I realized then that the fight had changed me, not by hardening me, but by clarifying what mattered. I was not waiting for permission anymore. I was not asking to be included. I was home. One afternoon, there was a knock at the door I didn't expect. I opened it slowly, already knowing who it would be. My son stood there alone. No rehearsed speech this time. No one beside him to guide his words. He looked older somehow, not from time but from understanding. He didn't step inside right away. He asked if he could come in. The question mattered. I nodded. He stood in the hallway looking around as if seeing the house for the first time. Not as something to be sold, but as something lived in. He said the silence had followed him wherever he went. He said leaving hadn't brought relief. Only clarity. He told me he was sorry. Not quickly. Not easily. He spoke about fear. About choosing comfort over courage. About letting someone else speak louder than his conscience. I listened without interrupting. Apologies don't erase the past, but they do reveal whether someone has finally turned toward the truth. I told him I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had burned out, leaving something firmer behind: self-respect. I told him love does not survive where fear makes the decisions. He nodded, tears forming, not dramatic but honest. Before he left, he asked if things could ever be different. I didn't promise anything. I told him healing doesn't move backward. It moves forward slowly if it moves at all. When the door closed, I felt no triumph. Only quiet certainty. Some lessons arrive late. But when they do, they change everything that follows. After that visit, I didn't rush to fill the silence with hope. I had learned what hope costs when it is extended too freely. Instead, I allowed things to settle naturally, without promises or expectations. My son called occasionally, short conversations, careful words. We were learning each other again, not as roles but as people. I spent more time with myself. I read in the afternoons, walked slowly through familiar streets, let my thoughts come and go without fighting them. Aging, I realized, isn't about losing relevance, it's about shedding illusions. You see more clearly when you stop trying to please everyone. The house felt steadier now. It no longer echoed with tension. I planted flowers near the front steps, something I had postponed for years. Watching them grow felt like a quiet rebellion against the idea that my life was narrowing. Growth does not ask for permission. It happens where it is allowed. One evening, my son asked if he could bring his child to visit sometime. Just for tea, he said. No expectations. No pressure. I paused before answering. I told him we would see. Boundaries once drawn should not be rushed to erase. As I sat by the window later watching the sky darken, I felt a calm that had nothing to prove. I had chosen myself when it mattered. Whatever came next would arrive on terms shaped by honesty, not fear. I understood something deeply then. Being old does not mean being finished. It means knowing exactly where you stand and refusing to be moved from it. The visit happened weeks later, quietly, without ceremony. My son arrived with his child, standing at the door the way people do when they are unsure of their welcome. I opened it fully and stepped aside. No words were needed at first. The house knew how to receive them. The child looked around with curiosity, touching the furniture, asking simple questions. I answered gently. Children don't carry history the way adults do. They arrive open. Watching that felt like breathing after a long pause. My son stayed mostly silent, observing, measuring my reactions, as if afraid one wrong moment might undo everything. I didn't reassure him. Reassurance comes after consistency, not before. Instead, I made tea. Ordinary acts rebuild trust more honestly than promises. At one point, the child asked whose house this was. I answered without hesitation, it was mine. The word landed softly but firmly. My son looked at me then, not surprised but understanding. Ownership had never just been about property. It was about presence. When they left, my son thanked me. Not for forgiveness. For time. I nodded. Time is the only thing that cannot be demanded. It is only given when safety returns. That evening, alone again, I felt no loneliness. Only balance. Some bonds are not broken. They are reset. With truth, distance, and respect. And I finally understood that protecting myself had not destroyed my family. It had given it a chance to exist honestly. That night, I walked through the house with a different awareness. Not to check what remained, but to acknowledge what had endured. The walls no longer felt defensive. They felt settled, as if they recognized that I had chosen myself and in doing so, had chosen peace. I turned off lights slowly, not out of habit but out of care. I thought about how close I had come to being removed from my own life by polite voices and reasonable words. How easily people confuse age with absence. How quickly they assume endurance means consent. I had survived not because I was protected but because I finally protected myself. In the quiet, I realized something that surprised me. I did not hate her. Hatred would have tied me to the very power she tried to claim over me. What I felt instead was distance, clean, measured, final. Some relationships do not end with forgiveness. They end with clarity. My son's visit had not healed everything. It had simply proven that honesty could exist where silence once ruled. That was enough for now. I no longer needed to be central in his life to feel whole in my own. I had stepped out of the role they assigned me and reclaimed the one I had earned. I sat at the table where decisions had once been made without me, and placed my hands flat on the wood. I felt steady, present, unmovable. If tomorrow brought change, I would meet it standing. If it brought solitude, I would fill it with meaning. Because I had learned the most important truth of all. A woman does not become small because others wish her gone. She becomes powerful the moment she refuses to leave. Now, when I sit by the window in the early morning, the house feels like an extension of my breath. Quiet but alive. I no longer listen for footsteps that might push me aside. I listen to myself. To the rhythm of days shaped by choice, not fear. I think often about how close I came to losing everything, not through force but through politeness. Through the belief that love requires sacrifice without limits. I know better now. Love that demands erasure is not love. It is control wearing a gentle face. My son still calls. Sometimes we talk about small things. Sometimes we sit in silence on the line, learning a new way to exist. I don't rush him. Growth has its own pace, and mine is no longer dictated by anyone else's comfort. This house remains, not as a victory but as a truth. Stands because I stood, because I refused to trade my place in the world for someone else's convenience. Age did not weaken me, clarified me. If someone listening to this feels the ground shifting beneath them, I want them to know this. You are not a burden for needing space. You are not selfish for staying. You are allowed to take up room in the life you built. I am still here. Not waiting. Not fading. And that, more than any inheritance, is what truly belongs to me.